Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Today, we're going to be talking about land use and housing development and growth in the East Bay. I'm joined by Lisa Vorderbrueggen from the Building Industry Association, or BIA, of the Bay Area. She is the executive director of government affairs for the East Bay. Lisa, thanks for joining us today. Tell me a little bit about what is the BIA and what is their role related to land use and housing growth in the Bay Area?
BIA Bay Area is a membership organization. We have about 400 company members doing everything from architecture design to landscape design to building and putting together a number of the homes throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. And what I do is I advocate on their behalf with local governments, state governments, et cetera, to try to promote better housing policies so that we can get the housing that we really need for the residents of the Bay Area.
And so, what is better housing? That's a broad.
More of everything. Housing for all is more housing. We underbuilt and underproduced for so many decades, and we continue to do so. And the lack of supply is a major contributor to the inaffordability crisis that we're having throughout the Bay Area. That's pretty much unprecedented and has become the talk of the nation. And we even have President Biden talking about the housing shortage this week. It is a major topic on every local city council agenda, board of supervisor agenda, state agendas, legislature. We've had the year of housing now every year for the last few years because it has become such a problem.
The state can't grow population wise if we can't house people.
Types of qualified people in that we want in these communities to take the jobs that we need because they can't afford to live here. They're living in far-flung places and driving long ways to those jobs and creating a lot of the traffic congestion, which contributes to the air pollution issues. And so we have this circular firing squad that we keep aiming at ourselves. And the actual solution is to build more housing.
In 2017, Governor Gavin Newsom pledged to do 500,000 new builds per year, fostered by private industry. And the state has done a good job requiring housing plans, requiring new elements from the cities, and coming with, we're 7 years now, roughly, into that pledge. How close are we?
I think we might have actually built 500,000 units total in that 7-year period. I think we hit 110,000 in 2023 new units across the state. Kudos to Gavin Newsom for making this an aspirational goal, but we haven't even come close. And I think that speaks to the death by 1,000 cuts that every developer faces when trying to put forward a housing project. There are so many areas where a project can experience delays, extra costs, where infeasibility comes into play, or community opposition, or excessive problems trying to get it electrified because of issues with trying to hook up to the grid. There's just a laundry list of things that a project faces before it can ever get constructed.
Okay, so how would you streamline that approval process on that local level? What are the recommendations from BIA to move that along a little bit faster and easier?
Oh, if I were queen for a day, what would I do? I think every community is required to have a general plan and a housing element, and they've designated properties for housing. Do it. Don't make projects go through these endless series of hearings and discretionary approvals just to get the housing that your community has already said is an appropriate location for that housing. We put these projects through this gauntlet that is just unnecessary. And when we get to that point, I think maybe we might see some progress. Of course, there's lots of other regulatory issues, et cetera, and problems connecting to PG&E and other utilities because our grid is just falling behind. But really, at the regulatory process at the local level. And then once that housing application comes in, process it. Get qualified staff that can deal with it. Don't get partway down through the approval project. Oh, I forgot. Oh, there's one more thing. So there was constant cycling back and forth of trying to get these projects approved. And we have one project in a North Bay City where They've had 4 city managers in 4 years. They've had multiple city engineers. Every new city engineer that comes in has a new interpretation of what the development agreement says. And so you get, constantly tied up. Labor costs have gone up along with everything else in our inflationary world. It just makes everything much more expensive.
which goes to the consumers who are buying the units. If we want affordable units or middle class units, it gets harder with all of these delays.
And we're shooting ourselves in the foot by imposing really high inclusionary requirements on new projects, which in most communities in the Bay Area have these requirements now, where it says a certain percentage of the units that you're building must be set aside for low income households. And they call it affordable housing. It's not affordable housing, it's subsidized housing. And yes, we absolutely need to pay attention to housing at all income levels. But if you subsidize the lower income households with the higher income households, you're just making the higher income households more expensive. So they have to charge more for those. And so the houses that are on the market then all rise, with the market. And so you have fewer and fewer people who can actually qualify to buy a home. And it's this circular firing squad. If you were to approve more housing, have more housing on the market, stabilize the prices, allow more housing that is affordable by design, meaning smaller units, then we wouldn't have as big of an issue as we have now.
Yeah, I experienced that in San Francisco when they were raising my rent. I lived in a building that was not rent controlled. I didn't know, having come from another state that didn't have rent control, that was something I needed to look for when you were living somewhere for 5 or 6 years. Somebody even said to me in the high rise building that if we didn't have to have 20% below market, your rent would probably be $400 to $500 cheaper per month. That it had that much of a significant impact on the rest of us.
Oh, yeah, I believe it. Now, we have had affordable housing bonds in which a broader segment of society is helping to pay for that subsidized housing. That's a more appropriate way to fund those types of projects. But because they've gotten so expensive, I think one of the latest numbers I saw said it was between $750,000 to $1 million per unit to build these affordable housing units. That's a huge subsidy. The rest of the buyers in a project have to pay. And if 20% of the units times that $1 million a piece, even the $20 billion affordable housing bonds that's headed for the ballot in the Bay Area, you just don't get that many units once those numbers get that high. And obviously there's got to be other solutions than just requiring the buyers of new homes to pay for that. Because we're not getting anywhere. We've had inclusionary policies in the Bay Area for how many years? And we're worse off than we've ever been. So they're clearly not working.
Let's talk about that housing bond for a moment. Educate us. What is in it? We haven't really talked about it yet on the podcast. What do you know that's in it? What does it look like? And just give us the facts and then give us like your thoughts on the conversation as an organization.
BIA Bay Area hasn't taken an official position on the bond. But to back up a little bit, it's $20 billion bond that will go on the ballot in November. The Metropolitan Transportation legislation approved to allow them to put this on the ballot. It's going to be paid back with property taxes, where you're based on the value of your home. You will pay a certain amount of dollars each year on your property taxes to pay back on this bond. The money will be allocated. I think roughly 80% of it will go to the local jurisdictions, and each local jurisdiction will have to put together an expenditure plan on how they're going to spend that money, which this group called BAFA, the Bay Area Affordable Housing, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but it's essentially the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and they'll have to approve these expenditure plans. And the other 20% will be handed out by MTC toward affordable housing production, preservation, other types of policies that are intended to help preserve and add to the housing stock for folks in low-income households. The voters will get to decide. Now, under the current law, 2/3 of voters have to approve it before it would go into effect. There is another law headed to the ballot in November that would lower the threshold for these types of bond measures to 55%. If that measure passes with 50% plus one, which is a majority vote, and if the housing bond gets at least 55%, then it would pass as well. because it's on the same ballot. So those two things are intricately tied together. From BIA's perspective, we were watching the language closely because we have concerns that there are a lot of labor standards that are applied to it. There's a lot of various local policies that are desirable by local groups to have placed on conditions on the money. And we were concerned that this would somehow bleed over into private development and construction. And we were working hard to ensure that and is not the case. We haven't really taken an official position on the bond at this point, but we have been closely watching it behind the scenes.
We recorded that section on the Housing Bond Initiative prior to NTC pulling it from the November ballot. However, I think it was important context to the overall housing discussion and was valuable content for the listeners. Keep watching in 2026 and later in case housing bonds come on future Bay Area ballots. I want to ask you about housing elements and builder's remedy, but we dove right into painting the picture of what's happening in housing. Tell us a little bit about who is Lisa. Introduce yourself.
I have been in the Bay Area since 1996, and I moved out here to get married, of all things. I was a newspaper reporter in Nevada for a number of years before that. Came out here and I worked for what is now the East Bay Times, San Jose Mercury News. Before then, it was the Contra Costa Times, covering land use, growth, development, politics. And I was a political reporter and commentator for a number of years before the newspaper industry began to shrink and the opportunities were not as desirable as they once were. I was recruited by some folks over at the Building Industry Association, and I thought everybody needs a place to live. And I could absolutely switch over and become an advocate for housing. It wasn't an easy transition all the time. I do miss the newspaper business sometimes, although as a political reporter, I've probably dodged a major bullet because I'm not sure anyone's skin is thick enough to endure what the media has had to undergo in the last few years.
Let's talk about the housing elements in the Bay Area. How close to being done are people? Give us your perspective on what's gone right so far, what hasn't, and maybe where we stand.
Just to start on the positive side, a lot of communities have done a lot of really good hard work at looking at their housing elements and complying with the new and enhanced state laws on housing elements. The state gave the Community of Housing and Development (HCD) a lot more authority in their enforcement powers on these housing elements this last go around, and that's been great. However, there's still a number of cities that have yet to comply, and it's 18 months after the deadline. And because there are no penalties for failing to comply, other than there are some ties to some funds if you don't have a certified housing element. But to my knowledge, none of those funds have ever been withheld by anybody. At what point that actually becomes penalties remains to be seen. The state did take some action against a few cities down in Southern California for failing to move forward. And so Huntington Beach and some of those places. I think the state is sending a message that they intend to be serious about it. One of the potential penalties is that if you don't have a certified housing element as of the deadline, a developer may come in and file an application for a project that is not consistent with what the outdated housing element and zoning for that property is. So it might be at a higher density the community would have liked to have seen there, and the community doesn't have a lot of recourse because they don't have a certified housing element. So that was supposed to be this big penalty, but we've certainly seen a lot of jurisdictions that disregarded that deadline. And I think I just saw today that for the city of Saratoga, for example, they have 20 builders remedy projects that were filed there prior to the time when Saratoga got their housing element approved that will move forward. And a number of jurisdictions have been in that boat. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but when I last looked, at least a third of the Bay Area cities still didn't have approved housing elements. That percentage may have gone up since I last looked, but it's a shocking number of jurisdictions that have just.
And are they feeling the consequences? Are 20 housing projects in Saratoga definitely has somebody's attention there? How are they feeling the impacts of not complying?
It's a little hard to tell how these jurisdictions are reacting behind the scenes. There were some jurisdictions. I think there are still to be jurisdictions that contend that as long as they get a certified housing element, that these builders remedy project, no matter when they were filed, doesn't matter. They no longer they don't qualify anymore. I know that there's some efforts underway on that front, and I believe the city of Saratoga may be an example of a city that's recognized that no, that legal deadline does matter. So we're going to see going forward a lot of times these builders remedy projects that were filed were used as starting points in the negotiations between the community and the developer. And many of them have worked through some of their issues and they've moved forward. I think that was a good thing. Just the threat of it being a builders remedy project gave the developer some leverage to work with the community and say, look, you just can't say no. No is not an option. We can talk about what the project's going to look like and the amenities and this and that, but no is not one of the choices that you have. I do think that was helpful on that front. So it may not be as overt as simply because no developer wants to go into a community and try to force something through. It's very difficult to work in that environment. And none of them really want to do that. You don't want to go into a hostile environment where you're trying to win the community's approval for a housing project.
Yeah, it's changed what builders have to do too, because there is now this whole community outreach and education piece. And I think even if you do the builder's remedy route where you don't need it, I think a couple of them that I have talked to still want to do that.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah. They want to go into the community and be welcomed into the community. They're not trying to jam anything down anybody's throats. When you just get told no instead of, hey, what can we work out? What's reasonable? It makes a big difference. I think the builder's remedy option really gave developers that ability to say, look, no is not one of your choices. Let's try to work this out. And if you can't, then we're just going to proceed. And the city certainly didn't welcome that. And so we've seen a fair number of that. Some of the cities that make some headlines with their builders remedy projects are cases where there's all out war between the developer and the city. You may have some elected officials in that community that are particularly rabid anti-growth people who drive that discussion behind the scenes and it's come hell or high water, there's not going to be any projects under my watch kind of thing. But fortunately, there's not as many of those folks as you might think.
well, and one city, Portola Valley, they had their housing element decertified. And I do know that they did get a builder's remedy filed the next day. They were certified, but they hadn't implemented any of the zoning changes. And the state said enough, right? They came with a
Right,
bigger stick in this case and they
right.
had to pay the consequence.
And it's not that Portola Valley is this big place where a lot of housing is going to get built, but it does set the example and that the state has rightfully said, look, it's one thing to adopt the housing element, and that's all good, but you have to get the rest of your codes, ordinances, zoning, general plan in conformance. And if you can't be bothered to do that, then we're just going to allow development to move forward with or without that process. Most jurisdictions have tried to do that, and some of them have tried to use the language to build in some loopholes. And I know California YIMBY and their fair housing folks and ourselves and other advocates have been monitoring those housing elements very closely to ensure that some of that stuff doesn't make it through and get approved. And of course, ACD has been very receptive to hearing about issues where these housing elements and the accompanying zoning stuff doesn't match up. They have a whole process now where you can report to the HCD some of these gaps and they pay attention. That's been a big improvement over previous years. I mean, right now we're looking at the city of Tracy. Tracy's putting forward a plan to rezone 260 acres around 121 parcels. They need to accommodate about 6,600 units. That amounts to 30 units per acre, which is like a condo, townhome, large. That's a pretty dense product. And Tracy doesn't have a lot of that. And is there really going to be a market for the acres of projects at that density? We're not so sure. We're
But
taking a look at that.
yeah, when I talked to then Mayor Meadows in Oakley and we were talking about it, he said, hey, our goal in Oakley, we'll build a couple of apartments and stuff, but we still have land. So we're thinking single family home growth and we could still hit our numbers. That made sense because I could see that people who want to live all the way out in Oakley and are willing to do that might not be the same people who want to live in Berkeley near a BART station.
And yeah, it's a catch-22, right? You definitely want to have more affordable housing in your community so that everyone who works in Oakley may have the opportunity to live in Oakley. But that isn't always a perfect matchup. And if a project doesn't pencil, an apartment building in Oakley doesn't pencil, nobody's going to build it. You can zone it all you want, and it's not going to happen. We have seen throughout the Bay Area, in an effort to get these numbers to work, properties being zoned at densities that are much higher than what the market will support. 100% of zero is zero, right? So if you zoned it for something different that builders would actually build, you get more housing. At the same time, I understand that communities do need to find opportunities and encourage some of this higher density properties, because these rental properties can be entry level places for families and young folks to move into until they're able to ever buy a house. But the further out you go from this core Bay Area, the prices get lower. And that's just been a function of location.
And right, there's a lot that plays in material fees going down to people buying homes, interest rates going from 6.5 to four and a
Yeah.
half. 4.5 versus 6.5 on $1 million house is a big difference on those monthly
That's a
payments.
huge difference, And in the terms of the number of people that earn enough money to, be able to afford that. And no matter how much we talk about the importance of transit-oriented development and building up and not out, so many families, young families who are starting to have their children, they want to live in a home with a yard. That's what they want. And it's going to be very difficult to persuade them that what they really want is to live in a high density complex next to BART. That may not be what they want when they're in their 20s and they don't have families and kids. But once they start having children and they just want that space, and it's the American dream. So we didn't invent it, but it's there.
Yeah. I'm chair of the Contra Costa Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee and been chair of the Walnut Creek Transportation Commission. And I bring that up and I say, this whole concept of millennials and Gen Z don't want single family homes isn't true. I think there's
No.
multiple factors impacting that. One, don't forget, they've come out with so much student debt from loans. They're focused on paying that and making headway or starting at smaller jobs and working their way up. But as they have kids, as they are moving out of the cities, maybe they'll stay and have kids in a rent controlled apartment in San Francisco. But once those kids are a little bit older, I know a lot of people that have left and
Right.
come out to the East Bay.
They see those suburban communities as a more desirable place to raise their kids. That may or may not be true, but each person gets to choose how they want to raise their families. And yeah, it's always that conundrum about what is this ideal policy versus how people actually want to live. It does make it difficult sometimes to make policy decisions.
Let's dive into a non controversial topic such as rent control.
Oh boy. Yeah.
If you see a trend in cities, what do you see in terms of the trend and what are you paying attention to in it? And what do you want elected officials who are listening to this to know?
The Bay Area, most of our members build for sale, market rate product and not rentals. We do have some that do some multifamily apartment projects, and most of these rent control laws do not apply to new construction. So it does, however, impact the willingness of people to invest in rental properties. One, if they know that those properties are going to have limitations on what those projects may be able to earn based on the market. So we do pay attention to it. We're also seeing an increase in some of our members who are building for rent single family homes. There's a couple of projects going on out in the North Bay right now. Single family homes haven't been subject to most of those rent controls. But if that should happen, that would affect that as well. I see it as being a popular topic among some groups who see the rising cost of housing as a serious problem, and it is. And many people see rent control as a solution. Unfortunately, if you make building multifamily properties or investing in multifamily property less profitable, more subject to issues with being able to actually make your loan payments and earn a return on investment, these companies are just going to stop doing it and they'll just invest that money somewhere else. We're already having issues with getting multifamily product constructed because the cost of construction is so high right now. And infill properties in our communities where this type of product is desired are very difficult to get those through the approval processes. So all those things will conspire together to just make those products more and more difficult to build. Rents just continue to go up, and you're going to have a self-fulfilling prophecy where you just have fewer and fewer of them. I personally don't see it as a particularly good market solution, but philosophically and ideologically, there are groups out there that pretty strongly disagree with that. I think as long as we have that, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about it, and there'll be a lot of pressure on elected officials to approve that. And we certainly saw that in Concord. And there was considerable public pressure put on the Concord City Council to go that route.
Uh, I've got a friend that maybe 4 to 7 units in Concord, I think a couple townhomes and a couple single families that were rental properties, that he was in the place after the crash in 2009 and to buy them inexpensively and rent them out. He has sold, I think, two of his, and his plan is as his sort of tenants leave. I think he said like one single family home, he's had a tenant for 10 years. He's not raising the rent that much anyway. He's happy with them, but his plan is to sell them all. And that's great because it flips a couple of units into the market to sell, but it takes away the rental supply. It does have consequences one way or another. What is the impact to the market if a city the size of Concord with 100,000 plus residents, how does it impact the pricing? You talked about the lack of bill. Let's say Concord's mostly built out in some ways, excluding the naval weapons station. How does it impact the rental and the upkeep of the existing unit supply?
I'm not an expert in that field by any
Okay.
means, but just by being a layperson thinking about it, if you have less money to invest in keeping these properties up, then they decline. The housing stock becomes more degraded and you have more difficulty. And then, of course, those properties perhaps get converted to for sale units because there's just no investors willing to take them on. It just seems to me that it's an ill advised direction to go. Some communities like Berkeley have had these rent control policies in place for many years. Of course, San Francisco has them. And if you win the lottery and get one of those rent control units, man, you're in. But it much like the regular housing market where the supply is so low, my husband and I, we live in a 4-bedroom single family house in Martinez. And the value of this home has gone to numbers that's really absurd. We could sell it and then go where? If we want to stay near all our grandkids and our kids, that money won't go very far. And there are very few condo type projects or smaller projects that would fit what we need. We just stay where we are. The young family that might move into this home and take advantage of this home has access to it. And we're seeing that over and over throughout the Bay Area. So on the other hand, we've been able to help some of our kids move back in with us and save money to buy their own houses because we have the room, which is what a lot of parents are doing these days. Is you in the Bay Area, you have to help your kids. And if you're lucky to be able to help them, you do, because otherwise they're not going to get into a house due to the costs. I think the home ownership rates are interesting because they don't really take into account all of the young people that are living with their parents who would like to own a home and can't. So I think the actual desire of people to have their own home is a lot higher than the numbers we're seeing reflected in the home ownership rates.
And other people just leaving to Texas
Sure.
or Vegas because they're like, I can never buy the house here.
And if you're in a place in your life where you can just pack up and go move to Texas, and if you want to live in Texas, I never had a desire to live in Texas, but
I don't either.
yeah, the housing prices are higher, but all my kids are here. 13 of my 14 grandkids are here. I'm not going anywhere. We just continue to survive by staying in our house and enjoying our Prop 13 tax rate because we've been in the house for so long and not go anywhere. I know a lot of people are not in that position to be able to do that. But we've known a lot of people that have packed up and moved to Tennessee and bought beautiful spreads, and they send the pictures. You see them on Facebook of their new massive properties, and good for them. But not everybody is, able to do that. I like California, I have to say.
Yeah, I do as well. And I've lived a lot of other places. I, 14 grandkids. That's a lot of birthdays and names to remember. So I give you credit for that if you can keep up with them.
Spreadsheet. I literally have a spreadsheet because otherwise I might forget.
Buy gift on this date.
Size, age, etc. I know. I'm always trying to keep up with these things. As they've gotten older, though, it's pretty easy. They just want money. You just give them cash. So grandma's
I
for,
feel free to send some my way
yeah, just what I need more of. So
or my kids. Free babysitting at my house. You don't have to give us money.
here we go. I do a lot of that.
Anything I might not have asked with the housing element or builder's remedy.
I know that for the various groups that I belong to and social occasions, and I'm sure, Jared, you've heard it as well. It's really easy to sit back and go, oh man, all those new people moving in and they're clogging up my roads and they're clogging up my schools. When you moved into your community, may have not been as welcome as you think, too. And if we sit back and remember that we all need a place to live and we all want our children to have safe schools and we all want to be able to get to where we need to go. If you wanted to live in a rural area where there was no traffic, you're free to go and do that. But there are trade-offs to that in the lack of certain amenities and resources, et cetera. Everything's a trade-off. And to just blanket oppose that project in your town on the grounds that you just don't want more. Think about when you moved in and what your neighbors might have thought when you moved in and whether or not you were that welcome. I try to remember that because I've actually confronted a few folks who were complaining. I think it was in Walnut Creek, actually, who were bitching and moaning about how long it took them to get through downtown. And I'm like, look, that's a really good problem to have. That means people want to be in your downtown. That means your sales tax budget is healthy. That means that your community is vibrant and growing. If there wasn't anybody downtown, you'd be in a bigger hurt than you are spending an extra couple minutes getting through the stoplights. Stop being so selfish, people, I guess is my bottom line, which is blunt, but I'm known for that.
I appreciate this. Lisa Vorderbrueggen from the BIA Bay Area. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.